Your Majesty, Your Royal Highness, Your Eminence, my lords, excellencies, colleagues, friends, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon from the Cambridge Centre for Palestine Studies, where we are holding an exceptional event to celebrate the release of an exceptional book written by 3 former UN Special Rapporteurs on occupied Palestine. The title of the book is Protecting Human Rights in Occupied Palestine, Working Through the UN. Here is perhaps a very important point to mention that when we talk about the UN, we talk broadly rather than the UN Security Council. We've received a few questions from a few colleagues asking in particular about this point. Ladies and gentlemen, we are truly delighted to be having today 4 towering international figures concentrating on international law and human rights, in particular in Palestine. We are delighted to be having with us Richard Falk, John Dugard, and Michael Lynk, who converse with them about the importance of this book, which was literally released a few weeks ago, just before Christmas. The 3 gentlemen, the 3 professors, experts have published immensely in the past, and they have indeed participated in many of our previous panels about Palestine, wars on Gaza, as well as other occasions such as the passing away of the late Archbishop Desmond Tutu. However, it takes truly a special step to make in order to address currently the evolving situation in Palestine, politically, security, of course, in terms of human rights and international law. Ladies and gentlemen, therefore, we have got a very important book, possibly the first book of its kind, where the 3 special rapporteurs come together and author this very valuable masterpiece. Clearly, as chairman and the host, we are not entitled to express our opinions, at least not personal opinions, and therefore we do urge, not that we need to do so with such 3 professors, we do urge the 3 professors to exploit, in brackets, our belief and practice in freedom of expression and academic freedom, and lead us truly towards the chapters and navigate, obviously, through the chapters as well as what they see as an ongoing process now in Palestine. Ladies and gentlemen, on your behalf, I would like to thank Professor Richard Falk, Professor John Dugard, and Professor Michael Lynk, and we shall start now with possibly the first question to Professor Richard Falk. Richard, not only that you are an internationally renowned academic and public intellectual, and just a year ago, we celebrated your personal masterpiece, autobiography. But now you have just released with Professor Dugard and Michael Lynk a book specifically about human rights and your efforts, as you have put it, your efforts or possibly attempts to protect human rights in occupied Palestine. Could you kindly let us know what's, from your point of view, the importance of this specific new publication, please?
Thank you, Makram, and thank your center for giving us this opportunity to discuss the book and the wider context of the evolving situation in occupied Palestine, and indeed in the whole relationship between Israel and Palestine. The book grew out of our experience over the last 20 years or so, while the Oslo diplomacy was dying and a new phase in the struggle of the Palestinian people to secure their basic rights was emerging. And we had the opportunity, I suppose, of being exposed to this turning point in the nature of the conflict. And at the same time, there was a lot of continuity in the way in which Israel was depriving the Palestinian people of their rights. And so it made sense to cover this evolving period from three different perspectives. We had different backgrounds. John had grown up and struggled against South African apartheid. Michael had been the most recent Special Rapporteur and had a long history of support for human rights struggles in a variety of contexts. And the fact that we knew each other and had compatible writing styles, which is extremely important in a collaborative enterprise of this sort, especially if it's kind of multinational in its character. And at the same time, we had enough diversity of experience. John had the opportunity to gain access to occupied Palestine, which gave an existentially crucial dimension to his reports that were based on direct observation of the conditions pertaining to the Palestinian people. I was not only denied access, but detained in an airport prison, in effect, before being expelled, and never had the opportunity to be in the occupied West Bank or Jerusalem, but did have one-time access to Gaza by way of Egypt, which was pre-Sisi Egypt, and therefore somewhat more sympathetic with the Palestinian struggle. And Michael had the burden of doing these reports without access, but with his gift for conceptualization and contact with the bordering countries, produced an admirable series of reports. So this, as was said by you, Makram, in the introduction, this is, I think, a distinctive undertaking where special rapporteurs of this, under the same mandate, collaborate to share their common and diverse experiences over time, and to show interested readers the kind of reporting that I think has given this position of Special Rapporteur a stature among governments and civil society over time, and for that reason has agitated Israel to a great degree. And really about the time of John Dugard's occupancy of the Special Rapporteur position, Israel shifted from responding substantively to criticism to this pernicious practice of weaponizing anti-Semitism, trying to shift the conversation to the messenger to divert attention from the message. And that has continued to be a very obstructive way in which Israel has tried to avoid a scrutiny of what cannot really be defended in any respectable, objective way. And none of the three of us are by the remotest view hostile to Jews or hostile to Judaism as a religion, but we are critical of Israel as a state and as a government that has embodied the Zionist project, which has led to the present juncture of events. And so in that sense, we felt that this book was worth undertaking and are pleased. I think I speak for the three of us, are pleased with the outcome.
Thank you, Richard, for this introduction. I can see that John will need to somehow sort out the video. However, since Michael is with us, could I kindly, Michael, ask you what exactly do you see that can be a very strong selling point to scholars, journalists, activists when they have this book in hand?
Thank you for that, Makram, and like John and Richard, thank you very much for organizing and hosting this. It's a great honor to be affiliated with a center at Cambridge University. I think one of the unique things we can offer, it's not the first time scholars have written about international law on the question of Palestine, but what you have in the book is excerpts from the reports from the three of us over the course of 20 years, grounded in international law, grounded in UN resolutions, and grounded in court reports, particularly the International Court of Justice. And I think, this offers a perspective. If there is a marriage between international law and justice, then there ought to have been a long time ago a fair and just settlement of the question of Palestine. So what you get here, I think, is two things. One is this application of international law, grounded in international human rights law, grounded in international humanitarian law, grounded in the countless resolutions passed by the General Assembly, the Human Rights Council, and the Security Council. But on the other hand, I think, which is a constant theme in all three of our reports, is the vast gulf between promise and performance with respect to international law and the role of the United Nations in protecting the Palestinians during the occupation and fulfilling the solemn promise of the right to self-determination. A wise scholar on the Middle East once wrote about 20 years ago that in the Middle East, international law is much closer to power than it is to justice. And I think that theme rolls through all of our reports over the last 2 decades, is how is it that we could pass the Security Council, the highest decision-making body in the international order, could pass, at my count, I think at least 11 resolutions with respect to that the settlements are illegal under international law and indeed are a flagrant violation under international law, quoting the Security Council itself. And yet these are allowed to continue to flourish to the point today where we have 730,000 settlers living in East Jerusalem, occupied East Jerusalem and the West Bank, 300 settlements. Every year they grow by about 20,000 settlers a year. And every government since the initial since the Israeli government during the 1967 war, which began the occupation, have permitted settlements to grow, be established, and to flourish, and for settlements to be continued. And I think, you know, if I can preempt perhaps one of the questions on your mind, but there are many answers to this, but the key answer is the role of the United States. Kofi Annan, in his eloquent memoirs called Interventions, published in 2012, said that the United States bears considerable responsibility for the fact that Israel is protected even from reasonable Security Council resolutions, he wound up saying. And then you ask, why is it the United States takes this particular position? And I invite you to go look at the memoirs of Barack Obama, his presidential memoirs, where he said that normal policy differences with an Israeli prime minister exact a domestic political cost in the United States that simply doesn't exist, he said, when I dealt with the United Kingdom, Germany, France, Japan, Canada, or any of our other closest allies. So then you have to raise the question of both the donor class and the lobby organizations within American politics that keeps the United States well-hued militarily, diplomatically, and politically to whoever is in power in Israel, and wind up acting as their diplomatic and military shield in many events. I'm sure you must have more. You will probably have questions during this panel with respect to the role of the United States. So I'll leave it like that. But I think that's where I guess our contribution lies best in trying to examine this vast yawning gap between promise and performance in international law when it comes to the question of Palestine.
Thank you, Professor Michael Lynk, for this introductory note. And now, since John is back with us, Professor John Dugard, you have had this wonderful, in brackets, opportunity to have lived in South Africa. You saw apartheid, you struggled against apartheid, and then you were appointed as a special rapporteur on occupied Palestine, and with access, unlike others who were denied access to the field. Could you kindly shed light on the difference between these two cases, despite the fact that you were not a special rapporteur in the case of South Africa, but indeed in the case of Palestine, and certainly you were very close to the late Desmond Tutu, who visited and spoke about apartheid Israel a long time ago, and possibly before anybody.
Yes, Makram, can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Yeah. Yes, I think that for me, the experience was particularly poignant because throughout my time as Special Rapporteur, and particularly during my visits to the occupied Palestinian territory, I had a great sense of déjà vu. I had seen it all before in South Africa, and there was no doubt in my mind that Israel was applying a form of apartheid, certainly in the occupied Palestinian territory, which was our mandate, and possibly in Israel itself. And what I find particularly depressing is that all three special rapporteurs, Richard, Michael, and myself, made it very clear that in our judgment, Israel was applying a policy of apartheid, but our views seem to have fallen upon deaf ears, because it's very distressing that the Western world has refused to accept the view that Israel practices apartheid, despite the judgments of the special rapporteurs and many NGOs in recent times. And I'm particularly upset by the fact that on the 21st of March of this year, the British government published a policy paper for a roadmap to guide the relations between Israel and the United States, in which it stated that the use of the term apartheid with regard to Israel is inappropriate. Now, I'm not sure whether the policymaker had Israel only in mind or whether it included the occupied Palestinian territory. I'm very confident that, in fact, it is intended to provide occupied Palestinian territory as well. And so we have the strange situation that one of the permanent members of the Security Council has already taken a decision that there is no apartheid in the occupied Palestinian territory, despite the fact that this is a matter before the International Criminal Court, and Britain, as we all know, is said to be a member of the International Criminal Court. I'm not sure whether it takes its obligations seriously, but it does seem to have completely disregarded its position as a member of the International Criminal Court. In effect, the United Kingdom is in a state of denial. It denies that apartheid exists in the occupied Palestinian territory, and by implication, it denies that the policy that was applied in South Africa between 1948 and 1994 was a systematic form of racism known as apartheid. So we have the bizarre situation that a leading government is in total denial. I wonder whether the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom realizes that had he been in apartheid South Africa, he would not only not have had the opportunity to become Prime Minister, but he would not even have had the vote. I must say I find this attitude on the part of the United Kingdom appalling. And it does, of course, indicate that the work of the Special Rapporteurs was totally wasted when it came to this decision.
Thank you, Professor John Dugard, especially that you have pointed out a very pressing point, at least if not worldwide, certainly in the bilateral relations between the United Kingdom and Palestine/Palestinians all over the world. And you, for those perhaps who haven't been following the news, Professor John Dugard has been talking about an agreement which practically was blessed and signed by the current British Prime Minister, who comes from Indian Hindu origins. He is British, but to this effect, Professor Dugard was referring his comment as well. Having mentioned these points, perhaps this is the time to go back to Richard Falk and ask him about truly the clash between the existing international law, UN Security Council decisions, and the political will or the geopolitics of the decisions, Richard.
Well, I think Michael's comments very much prefigure anything I would say, and his summary idea that the difference between international law's promise and performance is something that is characteristic of many conflicts where the permanent members of the Security Council are involved. In other words, international law at the global level often functions as a policy tool to make trouble for adversaries, but is rarely an effective inhibitor of the state that wants to pursue its ambitions in the world that depend on violating international law. And there's a kind of, in addition to this gap between promise and performance, there's also a geopolitical shaping of what has correctly been identified as very hypocritically undermining the whole idea of internationalism, human rights, international authority, and because of the reliance, especially by the United States, unfortunately, on double standards, being very worried about the treatment of the Uyghurs in China, but silent about the much worse and systemic conditions that have confronted the Palestinian people for decades. So this hypocrisy damages the prestige and authority of the International Criminal Court, of the UN, of international law, and I think exacts a very high price for the prospects for peace, let alone justice, in international affairs. And in a sense, the Israel-Palestine conflict is the tip of the iceberg. It's not the it's not so different from the way other issues involving the ambitions of these actors that enjoy the right of veto in the Security Council pursue their national interests and pursue them free from even the UN obligation to adhere to the UN Charter. In other words, the UN itself was designed to fail if it hoped to contain the most powerful countries in the world. I suppose that's a provocative way of putting it. It could be also expressed as saying the founders of the UN understood the limits of internationalism. So they tried to control the weaker countries, but recognized their helplessness to do anything beyond the self-restraint of the powerful one. And it is the tragedy of the Palestinian people that they are confronting not only the Israeli government, but has been already mentioned, the extraordinary commitment of the U.S. To serve its interests in the region and to uphold its peculiar balance of power domestically. I mean, as the Obama memoir suggested, there is no issue that's quite like Israel for the American leadership, and it has completely resulted in the submission of Congress to the Israeli lobby in the U.S. So there is no countervailing force. The Palestinians have not been able to organize in such a way as to neutralize this influence exerted by the pro-Israeli lobbying groups that exert unprecedented influence, maybe comparable to the gun lobby in the US, but something that is very formidable. And again, in the gun lobby, it illustrates the situation where there is no countervailing force to the gun producers, even though public opinion would like to see very much stricter gun regulation than is politically feasible. And even public opinion on Israel-Palestine has shifted, but the government hasn't shifted because there is no self-interest on the part of politicians to support a balanced approach to Israel-Palestine. And at this stage, I wonder myself whether a balanced approach is even coherent, given the degree to which Israel has pushed apartheid, and we haven't referred to settler colonialism, but one of the features in the terminal phase of settler colonialism is that if it doesn't get rid of the native population by total marginalization or dispossession, it loses, as in South Africa or Algeria. So, and my view is that the current government is faced with that kind of challenge of completing the Zionist project or of moving away from it and trying to become a secular unified state.
Thank you, Richard, for that. And picking a couple of terms, such as double standards or hypocrisy, may I kindly ask you, Professor Michael Lynk, about this truly expression of double standards. We are approaching issues from a multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary fields. Clearly, we can talk about political sociology, social psychology, and examine double standards, hypocrisy, etc. But when some scholars and observers see the way the ICC, for example, relate, refer, treat other states, say recently Russia, and on the other hand, they have been somehow not properly addressing the acuteness of Palestine. There are here two questions. One, how do you kindly describe it? And two, what is it to be done in order to change the situation, please?
Sure. You know, when you think of international law and the question of Palestine, there is no occupation or conflict or struggle in the modern world where international law has spoken with such consistency and with such volume and with such urgency as on the question of Palestine. You think of the hundreds of resolutions that have passed through the General Assembly, the dozens of resolutions that have passed through the Human Rights Council, and the scores of resolutions that have passed through the Security Council on this particular issue. And yet there is very little appetite to try to hold Israel to account with respect to this. This not only fails international law. You know, you think international law is not a menu a la carte. You cannot cherry pick as to what you decide you're going to obey and what you refuse to obey. This fails not only the international rule of law, but it also fails political realism as well. If a country understands that the resolutions passed against it, which represent the judgment, the wall-to-wall judgment of the international community, are not for obeying, then that only gives succor to any other regional or international power to be able to flaunt what have been the agreed upon rules of the international order since 1945. We cannot have a situation where we say international law for thee, but not for me. And to be able to display this, John mentioned a few minutes ago the agreement, the roadmap agreement that was signed between Israel and the United Kingdom upon the visit of Prime Minister Netanyahu last week to London. One of the pieces of agreement or provisions in that agreement said, and I'll quote, "The United Kingdom and Israel believe that the latest International Court of Justice referral on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict represents an inappropriate recourse to the advisory opinion mechanism, as this undermines the efforts to achieve a settlement through direct negotiations between the parties, which remains the only viable path to a lasting peace," unquote. One doesn't know really, I'm afraid, whether to laugh or cry with respect to that. The world can say, perhaps with some righteousness, Palestinians don't take up armed arms and attack Israeli civilians. But then you say to them, you must only use nonviolent or peaceful methods, and then you successfully close off any door that they could go through diplomatically, politically, to be able to raise their issues at the international level when Israel is so obviously intent not to have a Palestinian state, not to engage in good faith negotiations, not to allow Palestinian self-determination to wind up emerging with respect to this. On December 30th, 2022, the UN General Assembly passed overwhelmingly a resolution seeking an advisory opinion to the International Court of Justice, the highest court in the international system, asking it to rule on a series of questions with respect to the occupation of Palestine, including, in effect, whether the occupation remains lawful after almost 56 years, what are the legal consequences arising from patterns of discrimination between Israelis and Palestinians, and several other related questions as well with regards to this. This is an appropriate and responsible move by the UN General Assembly in order to bring greater, if it's needed, greater legal and political clarity to the question of Palestine. What the world, the international community, and particularly Europe and North America, may say rhetorically is that, yes, yeah, there may be some illegalities attached to the occupation, the settlements, for example, or the annexation, for example, or the location of the separation wall, but the occupation as a whole is lawful. But it's almost impossible to be able to say that after 56 years, when the standard, one of the cornerstones of occupation in alien rule is temporary and exceptional rule of one party or one people over another. That has to be an exception in the international situation. We don't allow annexation and have not allowed annexation since the end of the Second World War, when we outlawed it by the creation of the United Nations and its charter. Yet annexation has occurred, notwithstanding the resolutions from the Security Council, which Israel has not obeyed. Settlements have grown as a form of de facto annexation on the ground, which the international community has condemned. Israel has refused to obey with respect to this, and yet we see no coherent response to this. And this is particularly, as Richard has alluded to, in contrast to the wrapping around of the flag by the Western, by the global North, with respect to the Russian invasion and occupation of parts of Ukraine. So the double standards between Ukraine and Palestine are exceptionally glaring, and yet we are not in a position to be able to take any decisive action to it, as I alluded to before, because of the United States. If I can just end off with citing another very revealing comment from the Obama presidential memoir from 2020. He said, just about every country in the world considered Israel's continued occupation of the Palestinian territories to be a violation of international law. As a result, our diplomats, American diplomats, found themselves in the awkward position of having to defend Israel for actions that we ourselves opposed.
Thank you, Professor Michael Lynk, for this very important part, and certainly for the quotations. Today is the 30th of March, and it's a very important day for Palestinians in general. It's exactly the 47th anniversary of the Land Day, Yawm al-Ard. And interestingly enough, to those perhaps who didn't research the matter, the Land Day was not instituted or invented or broke out in the 1967 occupied territories, nor in the Palestinian diaspora. It happened, it took place, and the killing of 6 Palestinian Israeli citizens in 1976 on the 30th of March took place actually in Nazareth and Sakhnin and the Triangle. It's an event which is linked, Professor John Dugard, to possibly 2 aspects according to the literature that we have been looking at. On the one hand, it's the evolving apartheid towards the Palestinians who are Israeli citizens. But on the other hand, I was wondering if you could shed some light on the correlation, if there is anything, between confiscation of lands in historical Palestine in general and obviously international law and apartheid, and where does it begin and where does it end? Do we call apartheid, according to B'Tselem and Human Rights Watch, etc.? Do we call apartheid Israel in Western Palestine, i.e. in 1948? Do we call apartheid in 1967? Do we call it all over in historical Palestine? If you could kindly shed light on this, please.
Well, it's interesting that the NGOs that have recently produced reports on the subject of apartheid, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and others have all taken the view that Israel practices apartheid in Israel proper, that is the area between the sea and the 1948-49 and the other view that apartheid applies mainly in the occupied Palestinian territory. But they take the view that apartheid applies between the sea and the Jordan River. I think the distinction between the 2 relates principally to the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court. The International Criminal Court has jurisdiction only over the territory of a state party to the International Criminal Court. And the state of Palestine, which exists in terms of the 1967 borders, is a party to the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. And so the whole debate about whether Israel has committed international crimes in terms of the Rome Statute relates to the occupied Palestinian territory. And that is why the focus has been very much on the question of occupied Palestine. And I think one must admit that accept that the apartheid that applies in the occupied Palestinian territory is a particularly brutal and aggressive form of apartheid, whereas the apartheid that applies in the occupied Palestinian, in Israel itself, is undoubtedly discriminatory, but it lacks the brutality of the apartheid that applies in the occupied Palestinian territory. So that's why I tend to take the view that the Achilles heel of the Palestinian issue is the occupied Palestinian territory, and that is why the focus of attention of the International Criminal Court and the International Court of Justice in the requested advisory opinion is on the occupied Palestinian territory itself. So I think it's important to bear in mind that the advisory proceedings will focus entirely on the occupied Palestinian territory. The court has been asked to pronounce on the question of whether the occupation is illegal, and so it will confine itself to the occupied Palestinian territory. And as I already mentioned, the International Criminal Court is also limited in respect of its jurisdiction to the occupied Palestinian territory.
Right. Thank you, Professor John Dugard. Professor Richard Falk, can you hear me, please?
Yes.
Yeah.
I'm sorry for the interruption.
No, that's all right. You must have been following the news coming from various spots in several cities, localities, where Israeli society, or at least half of it, went to the streets, and they have been doing so for a few weeks. This is obviously following the attempt process of the current Israeli government to change somehow the position with regards to the Supreme Court. Now, the Israeli Supreme Court and those who support the position and operation of the Israeli Supreme Court have been demonstrating, asking, demanding, emphasizing that they do not wish to see any change. However, if we look only on the last 5 years, it was exactly the same Israeli Supreme Court which 5 years ago ratified the nationality law in following, of course, the Knesset decision in July 2018, after which many NGOs, especially Palestinians who are Israeli citizens, applied to the Supreme Court against the decision of the Israeli parliament. However, the same Supreme Court actually ratified the decision of the Knesset, which Palestinian members of the Israeli Knesset called racist, discriminatory, and even the only Palestinian Arab Israeli citizen judge, one of 11 judges of the Israeli Supreme Court. At the time, he recently retired, but at the time was Judge George Carra, actually wrote a dissent opinion. He was absolutely against it. So on the one hand, you see a Jewish Israeli community asking or protesting against any change that the Netanyahu government would like to have with regards to the position of the Supreme Court. But on the other hand, this is the same Supreme Court practically that it seems, according to all these NGOs, ratified the current power structure of apartheid.
Yes, that's a very appropriate question. And I think to begin with, one has to understand that this conflict that's going on in Israel is between two parts of Jewish society, it does not really it really hardly considers directly the impact on the Palestinian people, and that's not what it is at issue. It's partly about power, who will exercise the dominant influence in the shaping of Israel in the future, and that involves, to some extent, a tension between the religiously oriented parts of the Zionist movement and the more secular parts of the movement that had been in substantial control of the development of Israel until very recently. And so this is an intra Jewish struggle. I mean, that's the first thing. And it would be naive to think that if the anti-Netanyahu protests succeed, that will suddenly be a sign that Israel wants an inclusive democracy that extends rights, equal rights to the Palestinian people. And referring back to what John Dugard just said about the differences between occupied Palestine and Israel, it's important to recognize that Israel itself, in the 2018 Basic Law, virtually endorsed, without using the word, an apartheid structure of authority and legitimacy, proclaiming that only the Jewish people had an exclusive right of self-determination, which is really a extreme form of paradox, in a sense that Palestinians are by law made strangers in their own homeland, and strangers or worse, sort of enemy aliens in their own homeland, who are explicitly denied rights of equal participation, let alone a right of self-determination. So the broader context suggests two things. One is that this extremist Netanyahu government does spell a bad phase ahead for the Palestinians living under occupation, because its administration has now been entrusted to very overt racists who really believe, as a matter of ideology and perhaps validated by religious faith, in the dispossession, or at least the total marginalization of the Palestinian presence in the whole of Palestine. And Netanyahu has pretended to be a moderate, but he's entrusted the most sensitive part of his governing process to the most extreme elements of so-called religious Zionism and such figures as Itamar Ben-Gvir and Smotrich, I think.
Yeah, Ben-Gvir and Smotrich.
Yes, but it's and so that is significant, at least in the daily lives of those living under occupation. But it should fool no one that the defeat of this movement is tantamount to the liberation of the Palestinian people from their long ordeal.
Thank you, Richard. I mentioned earlier that we might have a surprise. The surprise certainly wasn't the fact that today is Land Day, but the surprise is that we have got with us now Francesca Albanese, who is the current Special Rapporteur on occupied Palestine, who would like to congratulate you on the publication of your book. I hope that Francesca should be with us. Hello, Francesca.
Hello, everyone, and sorry for intruding. It was not my idea. I just wanted to attend
my idea
and listen to you.
If only because today is your birthday as well.
On Palestine Lands Day.
Yeah, exactly. This is what we mentioned. I'm not sure if you have seen the book, Francesca, but yeah, if you have, could you please shed a little bit of light or tell us why should everybody buy this book?
I have seen the book before everyone else other than the authors, because I contributed a foreword to the book, and I was really happy and humbled to add another pebble to the path that I'm continuing taking after the three distinguished special rapporteurs that preceded me. The book is fantastic. It's really, it really breathes what each and every of them has brought forward as a special rapporteur, and in terms of legal knowledge, legal expertise, in terms of humanity, in terms of vision. This is a very, very unique character of this mandate. It has visionary mandate holders. Not that the other colleagues are not, but maybe because of the sensitive nature of this mandate, you really need to be grounded, attentive, not to make any misstep, and therefore you tend to carry a lot of weight. And I feel very, very inspired by the legacy of my predecessors that, as I said, breathe through this book. There is a lot of critical appraisal of what each of them has been facing, both in terms of challenges through the delivery of the mandate and in terms of the historical context in which each of them ended up operating. And there is also a reference to the most relevant parts, according to them, of their respective reports, which is very interesting and also shows to the reader what our work as rapporteurs is about. I particularly enjoyed the final part of the book, where each of them gives a more candid, unfiltered sense of what their mandate has been exposed, pointing also to some of the failures, if I can say so, of the United System. And this is where I took from. I said, okay, and this is the language that needs to continue to be used. I mean, trying to also change the system from within a little bit. Voila, this is what I think.
Thank you, Francesca. Just a question about access, about being really a special rapporteur, but on the other hand, to be denied access. How can you truly, as someone who is in charge of this position or is the special rapporteur, can handle this denial in particular?
If the question is how do we deal with it? How do I and my predecessor have dealt with it? Diplomatic, legally, elegantly. So we do our work no matter what. It's a lot of sacrifice, of course, because it takes much longer to engage with partners remotely or even onerous to ask people who live under occupation to travel and to other places in the region. I find it personally outrageous, also because we do not have the budget to cover for their expenses. So it's unfair in many ways, and we have dealt with it. At the same time, my question is how to solve it, because I don't take it as something that unchangeable. It should change, because Israel maintains an apartheid regime, which also includes abusive practices in terms of deprivation of liberty, not only of the Palestinians under occupation, but also those who try to access. Israel has no right to stop either me or my predecessors or anyone else from entering the occupied territory unless there is a security risk, security reasons, a military necessity, because Israel is the occupying power. While what Israel is doing is really to extending its migration law interpretation of it to a territory over which it doesn't have sovereignty. So I intend to challenge this, but of course there are objective limitations, and I'm trying to also motivate the international community to change sort of rules of engagement with Israel, because otherwise they are just normalizing the occupation.
Francesca, if I may ask, just before you leave us, what are the couple of lessons that you learned from this book and the experience of, obviously, of your predecessors?
Well, first of all, I will not leave. I will just return to be an attendee, because I really want to follow the debate. But well, there are many things that can be learned. For me, it's difficult to say what I've learned from the book, because I was already very familiar with the work of Michael, Richard, and John, and also I've benefited a lot from their guidance as soon as I stepped into the shoes of the Special Rapporteur, as I assumed the role, and so I was also very familiar with their humanity. So, but again, for someone who doesn't have the privilege I have, yeah, both these elements are really a huge legacy. The humanity they carried through their mandate, and it shines through the book, and also the importance of the work they have done in shifting the discourse, because the discourse is shifting. I do see the trajectory that particularly John and then Richard and Michael have started, and I'm hoping to continue. But yes, I'm sure that this anyone reading the book will sense this, will find these elements.
Well, thank you so much, Francesca Albanese, current Special Rapporteur on Occupied Palestine, for congratulating your predecessors, and please do accept our sincere and joyful congratulations on your birthday. We will toast you all after that. I can certainly have water, and please do stay with us. That's an original one, Michael. We're not going to ask Francesca any more questions, because we will keep her for a different panel and session. But for the moment, truly on behalf of our panelists, as well as all our guests in the various rooms, we do thank you, Francesca, and wish you a happy birthday and many, many returns. Thank you.
And thank you for gifting me with this opportunity. Sorry for taking your space, Michael, Richard, and John.
On the contrary, thank you for being with us. Thank you.
A pleasure.
I hope that John will manage to come back to us. I am not sure if John is back. He's got issues with the internet. In any case, we will go further. Richard, just back to you on the issue of implementing truly UN Security Council resolutions. You, on the one hand, you are appointed, yes, by the Human Rights Council sitting in Geneva, but on the other hand, you are seen as part of the UN. Various communities in the world question the importance, and B, the results-oriented approach of your work. In other words, let's put it simply, they say that's great that they are producing very important reports, and as Francesca Albanese has just mentioned, the discourse, it seems, is shifting when it comes to the right of Palestinians. But on the other hand, neither the political system, the ruling political system, possibly at least 3 UN Permanent Security Council members, as well as the ICC, are not shifting. And when this is received by the audiences, especially Palestinians, and in particular in Palestine, and specifically in the territories occupied in 1967, I can read a lot of frustration. How can you please address this power struggle?
Well, that's a very probing issue, and I think Michael should also comment on it. Let me first thank and congratulate Francesca for being with us, and her gracious forward to the book is really something that all 3 of us are very proud of, and it really gives us a sense that even if no one reads the book, it was still valuable to undertake the project. And so we hope that this birthday is the beginning of a successful and satisfying year for you, Francesca. And you, more than the 3 of us, I think, face a more difficult Israeli challenge because of developments within Israel, and I wish you good luck in coping with it, and you've so far done brilliantly, so I have every confidence that your term as Special Rapporteur will bring glory to the position. Let me try to respond to Makram's important question. I draw a distinction between symbolic and substantive politics within the UN framework, and where special rapporteurs, and indeed the UN as a whole, has its greatest influence when geopolitical forces are engaged with an issue, is by influencing symbolic politics, and particularly the attitudes toward legitimacy that prevail among governments and shape international public opinion. And so I think it's a misunderstanding of the role and effectiveness of international law to think that it's the only test is whether it changes the behavior on the ground. The behavior on the ground is changed by the movement of forces that have the capacity to transform behavior. And that means either the people, either from below or from above. And in a sense, the UN has very limited capabilities to confront a geopolitical obstacle from above. But civil society has a great deal of opportunity and responsibility to take a situation of this sort, as it did with South African apartheid, and mobilize forces within international society through such nonviolent initiatives as the BDS campaign. And that eventually brought apartheid in South Africa to its knees and led to an unexpected transformation. Not because the leadership there had a moral epiphany and suddenly realized that apartheid was a terrible thing and racism was terrible, but because they made a calculated decision that they'd be better off with a constitutional democracy giving equal rights to all than trying to maintain apartheid and a racist regime in the face of such concerted opposition, mainly from below. One didn't have the geopolitical factor as strongly present in the South African context. And the UN did play a role in mobilizing a certain kind of sentiment, but there were strategic interests, strategic obstacles during the Cold War that led the principal Western countries involved with South Africa, the UK and US, to be resistant to exerting pressure on South Africa. But eventually, the popular movement from below did prevail, and the results, while not perfect, certainly represent a kind of liberation from an apartheid reality. And one can hope that that vindicates and validates the work of a mandate such as this, faced with obstacles, but still achieving, I think, a real impact on civil society, public opinion among governments and elites. And the very fact that Israel has resorted to excluding these special rapporteurs from even visiting the occupied territory, and then resorting to this kind of aggressive misuse of anti-Semitism to shift the conversation is an indication of the success in the symbolic domain of the position of Special Rapporteur.
Thank you, Professor Richard Falk. And before I ask the opinion of Professor Michael Lynk, may I add, please, just one question which we received from a Palestinian lady educator asking, until when will we wait until the UN and international community will be implementing their reports, i.e. your reports?
I wish I had the gift of prophecy to answer such a question about the future. I have the blessings of hope that it will come to pass, but how it will come to pass is locked in a mystery. But things. I've often talked about a politics of impossibility, and the fact that the Soviet Union imploded in 1992, no one anticipated. And same thing can be said for the collapse of South African apartheid. I'd been there a couple of years before, and it was seen as a ridiculous notion that Nelson Mandela would be released from prison and that the white leadership would voluntarily enter into a meaningful diplomacy to make a transition in South Africa. So I counsel hope, not blind hope, but hope based on struggle as the best transition strategy that I know of.
Michael, do you take the same position, approach, or have you got a different take, please? The sound, please. Unmute, please.
Thank you. Sorry about that. I agree wholeheartedly with Richard with respect to this. Optimism, not simply blind optimism, but realistic optimism, I think, is the essential prerequisite of any human rights struggle. And at the beginning or the middle of a very protracted struggle, and we've all seen examples of those in our own lifetime, it sometimes can be exceedingly difficult to imagine how this is all going to end well with justice and freedom as the end result. And I think certainly when we talk about Israel, and this is what we've been doing for the last almost hour and a half, we are offering very bleak analysis of what has been happening and where we are now and what it's going to look like in the near future. But I've got to say, during my time as Special Rapporteur, I found a number of reasons to be buoyant and to be optimistic. I think that's well grounded in fact. Look, first of all, the Palestinians have never accepted their fate, and they continue to demand, through many forms, a complete end to their occupation and subjugation. Secondly, the international human rights movement, which is an extremely influential, if you like, people's superpower, has adopted the position of Israeli and Palestinian civil society that the current reality is apartheid. And this winds up introducing a new and invigorating framework into understanding Israel and Palestine. Thirdly, there's a growing bridge between the views of Palestinian civil society and Israeli civil society that pays attention to the occupation. They speak in the same rights-based language. They've come to the same conclusions with respect to the nature of Israeli rule. And they all insist, Israeli and Palestinian, they all insist on a future that's based on the principles of freedom and equality. And fourth, international law is solidly on the side of those who argue for justice in Israel and in Palestine. And I say, whether you play bridge or poker or anything else, these are all winning suits. So that's where I find my optimism, and that's why I think my optimism is more than wistful hopefulness.
Right. Thank you, Michael, for this. We had a surprise, and now we are going to have a special guest who would like to comment and ask you a question. And this special guest is Professor Stefan Sperl. Professor Sperl studied Arabic at the University of Oxford and the American University in Cairo. He specializes in Arabic literature, but because he had an integrated career, he was as well with the UNHCR and the head of refugee studies. He speaks fluent Arabic and very much interested and wrote numerous articles and several books about Palestinians, let alone that he so much encouraged me already 22 years ago to teach the first course titled Palestinian Political Literature at SOAS, the University of London. Stefan, are you with us now? If you can hear me. I can see you. Stefan, I can
you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay.
Can you see me, please?
Very good.
We can't see you, but yes, now.
Now it's possible. Now it's okay. Look, well, thank you very much, Makram, for this introduction. And thank you for all the contributors to this extremely important, I think almost, I would say, historic meeting, looking back on what happened in Palestine, Israel in these last decades, an extremely tragic history. There's, of course, an enormous amount to say, but we've spoken a great deal about international law and the authority of international law. And in this context, I have a question to ask. I wonder if the key, so to say, counterpart, if not opponent of international law in this particular case, is in actual fact nothing less than biblical law. We have a situation where this particular territory was promised 2,000 years ago to an invading people who invaded it, according to biblical narrative, with total violence, and who were handed this territory, so to say, in perpetuity. We are now facing the fact that tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, or even millions of people firmly believe in the legitimacy of this promise and consider it to be far superior to international law. Isn't here, there is an issue here, how can international law confront a religious law which declares it to be invalid? This doesn't only apply, of course, to Palestine, Israel, it applies to all religious communities with their own law that may contradict or contravene Islamic law. I think the situation is particularly difficult because of a grave historical legacy. The narrative of the conquest of the Promised Land has for centuries justified colonial conquests in the Americas, in Africa, in Australia. There's a long history there. We have a book that is sitting in every church, in every Christian land that has that weight of authority in it. We are facing people who profoundly believe that they are justified in believing it. This is an enormous humanitarian problem. How can we find a way towards justice in these situations? And don't we have to actually look at that particular fact when asking ourselves, how can international law be applied in this particular case?
Thank you, Stefan. Well, quite a question. I can see your smile, Michael. Would you like to start, please?
Oh my! I was going to invite Richard, but if you've asked me, I'll make a stab at this, and then wait, hopefully, for Richard to pull me out of the hole. But the question you posed, Stefan, is goes right to the heart of Israel and Palestine with respect to what we've seen as overlaid both with settler colonialism and with both nationalist and religious belief systems that have justified and motivated this particular form of settler colonialism. When we look at the history of settler colonialism throughout the last, say, 400 to 500 years anywhere in the world, it's either fleeing from prosecution or persecution, but it's motivated perhaps by a religious belief of being a superior people, or certainly superior to those whose lands you've come to wind up occupying and then domesticating. And this is why, international law is so important. International law is, if you like, the one human-made modern belief system that grounds itself rhetorically, but I think also substantially, in issues of justice, fairness, and a belief in equality. It's the one system that everybody in the world has wound up, at least rhetorically, buying into since the end of the Second World War and the emergence of modern documents in international law. So that has to be, I think, our cornerstone, because every single country, at least that belongs to the United Nations, which is every country in the world, winds up in adopting membership, in agreeing to the system. And they recognize, for the most part, that international law actually works most of the time for the benefit of most people. And it's the exceptions that we have to wind up paying close attention to. So when you see, if you like, the tension between a modern, secular, system of law grounded in at least the cornerstones of equality, democracy, human rights, and you contrast that with religious and/or nationalist belief systems. It should seem obvious where our interests lie in which system to wind up adopting, and that's why I think Richard and I and John wind up insisting on the primacy of international law and reminding countries that have a direct stake with respect to the outcome of the question of Palestine, why it's so important to wind up applying those resolutions and those international law standards that they've wound up agreeing to. This would certainly supersede, I think, any form of settler colonialism. That's what I think is at the bottom of the struggle in Israel and Palestine that has been overlaid by both nationalist and religious belief systems. Richard.
Well, I agree very much with what Michael has said. I would just add that there emerged from struggles involving religious claims a normative consensus around the idea of secular territorial sovereign states in which peoples enjoy a right of self-determination. And that's culturally, I think one can associate that with the rise of modernity and the Westphalian treaties that were ending the religious wars in Europe, and the idea that it was important to build world order around the separation of religion and politics, and that the basis of the claims that are rooted in biblical tradition do not have weight beyond their human rights relevance in determining the shape that self-determination should take. So that the natural outcome after the British mandate over Palestine was to allow the majority population to decide its own political destiny. This was not done, and the UN imposed a kind of partition, division, that was itself a violation of the right of self-determination, as it's been generally construed. And one would have, if one began to give legal status to biblical claims like this, a great deal of additional ferment in the world. It would give a green light to religious extremism, and it would create new areas of combat. There already are significant expressions of this in the Islamic world. The Iran is a different kind of case, but I think one of the few durable achievements of modernity has been to base political legitimacy on the will of the people living in these territorial states, and to make religion a matter of internal practices and human rights, the protection of the right to religious views and how far they're reflected in domestic law, but not as a basis of an international claim.
Professor, sorry, go ahead, Michael, please.
I'm just going to add one brief comment with respect to that. I mean, if we were to allow, as Richard, as Richard so eloquently said, religious claims or nationalist claims to supersede what we now accept as these common rules of international law, then do we invite the Arab world to be able to regain title to most of Spain based on their hundreds and hundreds of years living there? Or do we invite Italy, as it actually did try to do 80 years ago, to be able to reclaim lands in Libya and Tunisia, because the Roman Empire had been supreme there for several hundred years, and there's lots of archaeological evidence of their life there. The world can't live like that. In my very first year in law school, in property law, we learned a phrase called the quieting of title, which basically means if you've owned a property for a certain amount of time, even if there were irregularities in long ago, those irregularities would be, I guess, forgiven, and you have a clear title to what you have. And I think that's the way in which we have to regard any modern nationalist or religious claims to lands that were held hundreds of years ago, or indeed thousands of years ago.
Right. Well, we do have here this interplay really between the religious and the national, and according to my understanding, whilst the international community and the national law can certainly recognize the national rights of a particular state or all states, I am not sure that international law includes, as we heard, requests or a struggle based on religious demands to be recognized. But anyway, Professor Stefan Sperl, back to you. What do you make out of what you heard from the two distinguished special rapporteurs? Is this something that fits your point of view or your starting point?
No, I think it completely agrees with my point of view. I feel personally, I feel exactly the same way about it. But the reason why I brought up this question is because we are facing the fact that the United States, for instance, as has been eloquently pointed out, has been consistently refusing to apply pressure on Israel to change its policy in the occupied territories. And I think one reason why there is such reluctance, not only on the part of the United States, but also on the part of Europe, to apply any kind of real pressure to change the situation in Israel-Palestine, is that particular Judeo-Christian baggage that is there somehow, that we can't get away from. I have to say that there is also another thing which makes it even more difficult and problematic, and is even more tragic, and which I also have to mention, and that is the enormous shadow of the Holocaust. That fact weighs enormously heavily on the situation and makes it even more difficult to apply any kind of pressure in this situation because nobody wants to be seen to step in the foot or of the Nazis. So this combination of that Judeo-Christian baggage on the one hand and the legacy of European anti-Semitism on the other hand produces a situation which allows the current impunity and injustice in the Middle East to continue. It's a concatenation of humanitarian tragedies which has produced this particular result. And I feel that to lead to some kind of dialogue between everybody concerned, everybody has to recognize that particular baggage, that trauma that is being played out on the Jewish side, on the Israeli side, on the one hand, on the Palestinian side, on the other. It's the most intractable, historically laden, religiously laden problem that we are facing. And I feel that it's enormously important to be aware of this particular background that weighs upon everybody if we want to have any kind of dialogue and understanding between all parties. Because in the end, dialogue with all parties is the only way that we can get some kind of justice.
Thank you, Stefan. Clearly, several books have been published about the issue of the Holocaust, the Arab world, etc. But broadly speaking, I'd say that having observed thousands and thousands of reactions coming from Palestinians, I can sum them up in one sentence. What have we got Palestinians to do with a crime that was committed by Europeans against Jews? This is something that has got to be dealt with within that paradigm, the European Jewish paradigm, rather than getting into the middle Palestinians who had nothing and have nothing to do with it. So this is somehow being used, it seems, against Palestinians in a sense that Palestinians, as well as even Jews pro-Palestinians, are not managing, as you put it, Stefan, to get rid out of this scythe, this sword hanging in the air. And this comment possibly is going in particular to Richard to address. I hope that John would be with us, but John had serious problems with the internet where he is, and he's not managing to sort them out. But Richard, if you could kindly save the day here about this formula, which is persisting, in fact.
Well, I very much agree with what you were saying, Makram, that there is no doubt that Jews have suffered from European anti-Semitism, and the Holocaust was a horrible shadow over the world at the end of World War II. But there's no legal, moral, or political justification for making the Palestinian people pay the cost of rectifying the wrongdoing of what happened in Europe.
Absolutely not. Yeah.
And it is something that through the decades, I think, you see, there's another aspect of it, and that is the erasing of the Palestinian reality in thinking about the establishment of Israel. And that was, it's a classic case of what Edward Said wrote so eloquently about in his book Orientalism, where the Palestinian rights were really extinguished in a de facto way without any consideration given to their situation. So you attempted to solve one tragedy by generating another tragedy.
Just so, yeah.
And that tragedy continues to flourish, so to speak. And the Zionist project had its own pre-Hitler racism embodied in it. It wanted to be a settler colonial project from the very beginning, before the Holocaust, and partly as a way of creating a Jewish sanctuary, but partly also as a way of crystallizing Jewish influence in the world. So it was a project that was given blessings by the UK government in the form of the Balfour Declaration, but even that was seen as pledging support for a homeland, not for a sovereign state that dispossessed those that were there. In fact, if you read the Balfour Declaration, it has a clause that has been forgotten, which commits the UK, at least, to respect the rights of the Palestinians in their own homeland, and that has been completely neglected over the period of years.
Thank you, Richard, for that. But just back, Professor Stefan Sperl, you were born in Stuttgart. You are a German, British who speaks Arabic, specializes in Arabic, even Arabic poetry as well. You are very much deep into the whole discussion and debate. One of the themes of the book, Protecting Human Rights in Occupied Palestine, working through the UN, is how the UN can improve its processes and procedures in implementing Palestinian human rights. Do you find it appropriate that the UN, via the Human Rights Council or otherwise, should be dealing with the point that you have mentioned about Palestinian human rights and the European Holocaust against the Jews in Europe?
Well, I think yes, because it is clearly in everybody's mind. People don't talk about it, but that past is there. It weighs upon everybody, and it has got to be recognized. And it's a legacy that we have to overcome. And those who are responsible for it have to acknowledge their responsibility. And also those who have suffered from it must recognize that it is not possible to make somebody else suffer in turn. There has to be a kind of recognition on all parts of what that past means and how we can get beyond it. Because at the end of the day, if there's any solution to be found, it can only be on the basis of a mutual acknowledgement, mutual respect, mutual understanding of each other's identity. And that understanding can only be reached if we take all this historical baggage into account and put it in front of us and say we have to go somewhere beyond, and that international law points the way. And it's a very difficult thing for the settlers to accept, evidently, because they stake their life on it. But we have to find some way forward. The alternative is permanent conflict, in which, with all that at the end entails. I mean, I think this situation is a profound historical tragedy. By recognizing it and understanding it, we may find a way forward. And of course, those who have to make a start here are those who are in charge, those who are in power now, which is the Israeli government, is the American government. Those who have the power are the first ones to stand back and understand and see who is now suffering and why.
Professor Michael Lynk, thank you, Professor Sperl. Please stay with us. Professor Michael Lynk, have you, during your period as a special rapporteur, have you encountered this difficult debate or persisting issue, and did it at all sabotage or affect your efforts?
Well, if you're referring to, I guess, obviously the struggle between Israeli Jews and Palestinian Arabs over sovereignty and a future in mandate what was then mandate Palestine. Yes, in many ways, and it's particularly the range of opinion that I would have encountered among Israeli Jews, both particularly abroad and by diaspora Jews on how to reach this. I will echo something or a reference or a source that Richard used when he cited Edward Said. Said had commonly talked about the Palestinians as the victims of the victims. And I can't think of a phrase, a nice, neat, short phrase that so epitomizes what we see going on over the last 100 years in Palestine between primarily European Jews who were escaping the growing shadow of fascism and genocide and intolerance, and the right of a people to be able to live free and exercise self-determination in their own land, i.e., the Palestinians. The political predicament that Jews in Europe faced after the First World War led them to several different possible solutions to this predicament. One was liberalism, which is primarily a continuation of assimilation into European societies, and they would live as a German or French or English, except they would have obviously a different faith. The second would have been a more revolutionary approach found in either socialism or in communism, which led many European Jews to join and indeed sometimes lead communist parties in the interwar period, and look to Russia as a source of inspiration and guidance for the future. And the third would have been Zionism, which is a complete divorce, which is basically labeling European society as inherently anti-Semitic, inherently that Jews would be inherently unassimilatable into European society, and therefore we must look elsewhere. And that elsewhere turned out to be a land where they could build, if you like, this religious and nationalist attachment because of the existence of Jews there 1800, 1900 years ago. But it was part of a colonial thinking that was in its ascendancy in that interwar period of time in Europe about the permanence and the naturalness of European superiority over the global South. Zionism borrowed from and integrated that same approach in its formulation of its ideology and its belief that they had superior right to the land of Palestine than the Palestinian Arabs who've been there for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. So we see, and as we've talked about before in this panel, how these belief systems with respect to nationalism and religious messianism can wind up resulting in enormous tragedy. It's something that was said in great eloquence in her book, The Origins of Totalitarianism by Hannah Arendt, which she published in 1951, which she said, the Jewish question or the Jewish predicament in Europe was solved by creating another refugee problem.
Thank you, Professor Michael Lynk. Richard, the idea of the book, as we heard, was yours, and clearly you are here, as we all know, the international towering figure worldwide. You have been dealing with international law, America, since the war in Vietnam. But now that you had served as a special rapporteur, you have your colleagues served equally in the same position. You have written many books about it. You are completely engaged on a daily basis with the Palestinian cause. In your opinion, or whether your feeling, perhaps, what does a special rapporteur need in order to have stronger teeth to implement what they produce in their reports?
Well, I think they have to have, ideally, the support of powerful governments. And if that's not available or possible, as the Palestinian case illustrates at the present time at least, then the support of an important segment of civil society and a mobilization from below. See, I think people have the agency to overcome geopolitics if they're sufficiently mobilized and motivated. And I think that's a real possibility for some of the reasons that Michael enumerated a few minutes ago. I don't think the issues that the special rapporteurs have been addressing will be solved by goodwill and mutual kind of understanding. In that sense, I disagree with what Stefan was proposing, because I think only coercive, nonviolent power is going to change the Israeli attitude toward some kind of resolution of the conflict. Power, not goodwill, in other words, and the question is, how does one mobilize effective power without producing a bloodbath? And I think that's a dilemma that those of us that are engaged in seeking an outcome that corresponds with the human rights and international law are ultimately seeking to overcome that dilemma, how to be effective without a bloodbath. And the South Africans do point at least a direction that took shape, and I think Israel understands that. That's why they're so sensitive about criticism and reluctant even to allow international institutions to adjudicate whether Palestinians are being mistreated by the standards of international law. So my hope rests on struggle plus the mobilization of civil society at this stage.
Right. Professor Michael Lynk, I know that the issue is not about a political discussion or even a discussion in political science and conflict resolution with regards to one state, two state solution. But the question is, and since the title of the book is Protecting Human Rights in Occupied Palestine, working through the UN, in particular in the last 20 years, and in particular in the territories, in the Palestinian territories occupied in 1967, i.e. Eastern Palestine, how do you see the role of a special rapporteur in at least protecting the 22% of historical Palestine, which the Palestinian leadership, or some of it, accepted, and which is now hardly controlling 4% of that historical Palestine, i.e. under the Palestinian Authority, which in fact at any time can be invaded at the wish of any Israeli officer in the occupation army. I mean, how do you see international law or actually your role in the past, your role metaphorically, protecting human rights whilst these legal rights, even if we accept the two-state solution, is being violated 24/7?
Well, first of all, I think we have to envisage where we want to get to, and whatever solution, be it a one-state solution or two-state solution, which honors both Israeli self-determination but also Palestinian Arab self-determination, it has to be founded on the cornerstones of equality, human rights, and democracy. In other words, a state or states for all of its citizens treated equally. In one of my last reports, my 11th report in the fall of 2021, which is reproduced in part in the book, what I said was that there would have to be 5 foundational criteria that would have to guide the path forward to reaching a just and durable solution. And I'll just let me quickly go through them. Number 1, because of the vast asymmetry of power between Israelis and Palestinians. The activist role of the international community is absolutely indispensable in trying to even the power at the bargaining table or the negotiations table. Secondly, the framework for fully ending the conflict or the occupation must employ a rights-based approach. It has to be anchored in international law. It has to be founded on human rights. Thirdly, the end goal must be Palestinian self-determination. Israel already, if you like, Israeli Jews already exercise self-determination. What the missing key to this has to be Palestinian self-determination, which is embedded in countless UN resolutions. Fourthly, and this is one of the most controversial aspects of it, the international community has to accept that Israel is and has been for a long period of time a bad faith occupier. By proving that through annexation, through the creation of the extensive network of settlements, through the location of the separation wall, through its treatment of the Palestinians, has shown that it's in gross violation of international humanitarian and human rights law. And this has to be accepted in how we wind up approaching Israel, not as an honest party coming to the negotiating table, but as a bad faith occupier whose goal, which should be thwarted, is to try to maintain as much of the land as possible. And fifth and finally, the occupation must end with all deliberate speed. This has been a cornerstone of thinking about occupation since the laws of occupation were developed in the early and mid 20th century, is that occupations are exceptions to the rule. They have to be temporary, they have to be short term, and the occupying power has to turn the land back to the sovereign power, which is the people living there, as soon as possible. And any other recent occupations, for example, Kuwait or Iraq, over the last 30 years, the UN Security Council has reiterated this has to end as soon as possible. So those, I think, are the defining criteria that we have to keep in mind and insist that the international community, particularly the global North, has to understand and implement in any path forward. What we have now, unfortunately, Makram, is the global North, Europe and North America, particularly the United States, they don't even have a plan A. This Joe Biden will be the first president, if there's no change in his approach towards the Middle East and the question of Palestine. He'll be the first American president since Gerald Ford not to have attempted to have some kind of a peace plan or peace process. We can all agree that they were ineffectual, that they were heavily biased towards Israel, that they were not grounded in international law. The Americans at least went through the pretense, even Donald Trump went through the pretense of having a peace plan. Joe Biden seems to be willing to accept that he's not going to have a peace plan at all and allow Israel to continue to manage the occupation, even as it winds up deepening it.
Thank you, Michael. Richard, you are in the States now. Michael is in Canada. You are in the States. You are American as well. But in your opinion, what needs to be done on both levels, the administration and the American public, in order to witness a shift in America's position?
Let me say that I have to leave after my response to this.
And I do too.
We will be finishing, yeah.
It's a puzzle. Congress is almost totally controlled by pro-Israeli forces. The president, Michael quoted the Obama memoir, that still to some extent pertains to the present situation. A president would pay a heavy cost if seen as going against the fundamental aims of Israel, despite their extremity. So I think the most hopeful scenario with respect to US public opinion and governmental outlook is somehow their neutralization through the extremity of Israeli policies. And that has begun to affect the way in which Biden articulates the relationship, which is quite different than what he was saying in Israel when he visited last summer and signed this declaration with Lapid, who was then prime minister. So and that sends a signal, I think, to liberal Zionists here in the US and Canada. It's okay to be critical of Israel at this point, that they are behaving beyond the red lines that were given them much greater latitude than international law allowed. But now they've gone beyond those red lines. And that creates a dilemma for these governments that have been supporting them and yet profess a kind of liberalism in their foreign policy, have praised Israel as the only democracy in the Middle East in the past. The present phase of the struggle suggests that maybe there will be a kind of unexpected shift in the relation of forces so that an American leadership can move away from this unconditional support, and that will give more space politically to other forces, including the UN, to exert pressure.
Thank you very much, Professor Richard Falk. It's been a great pleasure to have you in this wonderful panel, discussion panel, celebrating the release of your book, Protecting Human Rights in Occupied Palestine, working through the UN. On behalf of our boards, members, viewers, audiences, we thank you all, Professor Richard Falk, Professor John Dugard, Professor Michael Lynk, and certainly our special surprise, Francesca Albanese, and indeed our special guest, Professor Stefan Sperl. We do encourage you all to get hold of a copy of this very important book, and we hope to see you soon in another new, fresh panel. And in the meantime, we wish you all blessed Ramadan, Easter, holidays, and all the rest of it. Stay well and keep healthy. And here from the Cambridge Center for Palestine Studies, we always ring the bell.
Good.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.